The German shepherd stood frozen, its ears twitching, heart pounding. Its millionaire owner, the one it had loved unconditionally, was laughing, playing, with another pet. Something shattered inside the loyal dog. Betrayal burned deep. What happened next will break your heart. The grand estate stood like a monument to wealth and power, its towering glass windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Within its sprawling gardens, a lone German shepherd named Rex sat poised at the edge of the patio, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the figure he had adored since he was a pup. His owner, Daniel Whitmore, a self-made millionaire, the man Rex had pledged his silent, unwavering loyalty to, stood a few feet away. But today, something was different. Rex's ears twitched, his sharp senses picking up a sound that sent an uneasy ripple through his chest. A soft, high-pitched whimper. At first, he thought it was his imagination, some trick of the wind rustling through the hedges, but then he saw it. Daniel was crouched down, his hands cradling something small and delicate, a tiny white puppy. Its fur was pristine, its eyes barely opened, and its frail body nestled comfortably in Daniel's warm embrace. Rex's tail, which had been wagging moments earlier in anticipation of his evening walk, stilled. A strange, unfamiliar weight settled in his chest, something he had never felt before: confusion, uncertainty. For years, Rex had been Daniel's shadow. From the moment he was brought into the mansion as an eager, clumsy pup, he had become an inseparable part of Daniel's life. Through long nights of loneliness, through victories and heartbreaks, he had been there, silent, steadfast. He had waited by the door for Daniel to return from his meetings, had guarded him from threats both seen and unseen, had been the only living soul in the mansion who asked for nothing but love in return. And Daniel had given it. Until now. Rex watched as Daniel stroked the puppy's head, his fingers moving with a tenderness that Rex knew all too well. He had felt those hands before, scratching behind his ears, ruffling his fur after a long day, comforting him when the world felt too big and uncertain. But this time, those hands were not meant for him. The weight in his chest deepened. He wanted to step forward, to press his nose against Daniel's palm, to remind him that he was still here. But something held him back, a hesitation he didn't understand. Then Daniel spoke, his voice filled with warmth and affection. "Aren't you the cutest little thing?" he murmured, lifting the puppy higher, gazing into its tiny, trusting eyes. Rex's heart clenched. Had he ever heard Daniel speak like that to him? He tried to remember, but his thoughts were clouded by the sudden tightness in his throat. The puppy let out a small yip, and Daniel chuckled, pressing a gentle kiss to its head. And in that moment, something inside Rex cracked. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet pain. Rex observed as the house changed, its familiar rhythms disrupted by the presence of the new puppy. Daniel carried the tiny creature everywhere. During morning coffee, he cradled it against his chest, sipping from his porcelain cup while murmuring words of endearment to the pup. At night, when Rex used to curl at Daniel's feet while he read by the fireplace, the space was now occupied by the small, white ball of fluff. Even during their daily walks, an unspoken ritual between them, Daniel now carried the pup in his arms, leaving Rex to trot along behind them, an afterthought in his own world. The loneliness was suffocating. Rex had never known what it was like to feel unwanted. He had always belonged to Daniel. He had always been his companion, his protector, his friend. But now there was something unshakable in the air, a shift in the dynamic that he couldn't understand but felt in every inch of his being. He started testing it, small things at first. When Daniel sat on the couch, Rex would nuzzle his hand, seeking the comforting scratch he had always received. But Daniel, distracted by the small puppy curled on his lap, barely responded, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing over Rex's head before returning to the tiny creature resting against him. When Daniel went outside, Rex would race to his side, ready for their usual game of fetch. But now, Daniel's hands were too full, his pockets filled with tiny treats meant for the pup, his attention wrapped in the fragile being that needed him more. And then came the worst moment of all. One evening, as Rex stood by the front door, his leash clutched gently in his mouth, he watched as Daniel smiled down at the puppy and whispered, "Let's go for a walk, buddy." But he didn't reach for Rex's leash. He didn't even look at him. Instead, he scooped up the tiny dog and walked out into the evening light, leaving Rex standing in the doorway, leash still held between his teeth, staring at the closing door in stunned silence. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. He had been replaced. The nights felt colder now, even though nothing in the mansion had changed. The fireplace still crackled with warmth, the soft hum of classical music still played in the background, and Daniel Whitmore still sat in his grand leather armchair. But something was missing. Rex lay on the rug by the fire, his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded in quiet sorrow. He had always loved this time of night, the quiet companionship, the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing as he read his books, the occasional absent-minded stroke of a hand through his fur. It had been their ritual, their unspoken bond. But now, in Daniel's lap, curled into a small ball, was the tiny white puppy. Rex had spent his whole life trying to be the perfect dog for Daniel. Loyal, obedient, loving. He had never wanted anything else. And yet, as he lay there, he felt something gnawing at him, something he couldn't put a name to. He lifted his head slightly, watching as Daniel gently rubbed the puppy's belly, smiling as the little creature wiggled in delight. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, a slow, creeping ache that started deep in his chest and spread through every part of him. It wasn't just sadness. It was something more insidious. It was jealousy. The word meant nothing to him, but the feeling consumed him. Days passed, and Rex tried everything to reclaim his place. One afternoon, as Daniel set the puppy down in the yard, Rex ran up with his favorite ball, the one they had played with since he was a pup. He dropped it at Daniel's feet, his tail wagging, eyes filled with desperate hope. Daniel glanced down, a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but then the puppy let out a small whimper. Immediately, Daniel bent down, scooping the tiny creature into his arms. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" he murmured, cradling it close. Rex stood frozen, the ball forgotten. That night, he didn't sleep in Daniel's room. He didn't even try. Instead, he curled up by the front door, the place where he used to wait for Daniel when he was gone. But now, Daniel was home, and yet Rex had never felt farther away from him. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The household staff, who had once greeted Rex with cheerful pats and treats, now cooed over the puppy instead. The space beside Daniel's chair, the place where Rex had always curled up, now belonged to the tiny dog. Even meal times changed. Where Rex once had Daniel's full attention as he prepared his food, now Daniel spoke in soft, affectionate tones to the puppy, laughing at its clumsy attempts to eat. Rex tried to be patient. He told himself it was temporary. But the weeks passed, and nothing changed. Then came the moment that shattered everything. It was late in the evening when Rex heard it, a soft, playful bark from the backyard. His ears perked up, hope surging through him as he padded toward the sliding glass doors. And then he saw them. Daniel and the puppy were in the yard, playing a game of fetch. It was their game. The ball soared through the air, and the puppy scrambled after it, its tiny legs clumsy but determined. Daniel laughed, clapping his hands as it brought the ball back, wagging its tiny tail with joy. Rex didn't even realize he had stepped forward until his paw pressed against the glass. For the first time in his life, he felt like an outsider in his own home. The pain was unbearable. But it wasn't until Daniel spoke that the final blow landed. "That's a good boy," he said softly, scratching the puppy behind the ears. Such a good boy. Rex had always been Daniel's good boy. Always. something inside him broke. He turned away from the door, the ache in his chest tightening like a collar pulled too tight. His paws felt heavy as he walked back inside, but he didn't stop until he reached the staircase leading to the second floor. He hesitated only for a moment before slowly climbing the stairs. Daniel's bedroom door was open just a crack. Rex peeked inside, his heart pounding. The puppy was curled up in Daniel's bed. Not in a crate, not on the floor, but on the bed, nestled against Daniel's pillow, as if it had always belonged there. Rex had never been allowed on the bed. He had never wanted to be, until now. He backed away from the door, something unfamiliar clawing at his insides. He didn't understand what was happening, why the world suddenly felt so different, why Daniel's voice no longer brought him comfort. All he knew was that he wasn't Daniel's good boy anymore. Rex's world became smaller with each passing day. He no longer rushed to the door when Daniel came home. He no longer wagged his tail when he heard his name. Even food, once the highlight of his evenings, no longer excited him. He ate mechanically, without joy, without the anticipation of a hand ruffling his fur, telling him he was loved. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rex lay by the fence in the backyard, his gaze distant. The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass, the distant hum of city life beyond the mansion walls. And then, he heard a sound that made his ears twitch. Soft, delicate footsteps. He turned his head slightly and saw her, the neighbor's daughter, Sophie. She was around 10 years old, with bright green eyes and a quiet, gentle presence. Rex had always liked Sophie. She was kind, always stopping by the fence to talk to him, even when Daniel wasn't around. "Hey, Rex," she whispered, kneeling beside the fence, her small fingers curling through the metal. He didn't move. She tilted her head, studying him. "You look sad." Rex let out a slow breath, resting his chin on his paws. Sophie was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small piece of bread. "I saved this for you," she said, holding it out. Rex hesitated. Daniel used to give him treats like this. A long time ago. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned forward, his nose brushing against her palm as he took the small offering. She smiled. "Good boy." Rex froze. The words settled over him like a blanket on a cold night. Software familiar. Warm. His tail twitched. Just the smallest movement, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to feel happy anymore. Sophie didn't say anything else. She just sat there, her fingers absently tracing patterns against the fence as the sky darkened around them. For the first time in weeks, Rex didn't feel alone. But deep inside, a question lingered. If he wasn't Daniel's good boy anymore, then who was he? The days blurred into a monotonous cycle. Rex no longer waited for Daniel by the door. He no longer wagged his tail at the sound of his voice. The man he had once worshipped, the man who had been his entire world, had slowly drifted away, and Rex had let him. One evening, rain drummed against the glass walls of the mansion, casting a soft, rhythmic echo throughout the silent house. The lights were dim, and Rex lay curled near the entrance, his ears flicking at the occasional sound of thunder in the distance. He barely reacted when Daniel walked in, shaking the rain from his coat. The tiny white puppy trailed closely behind him, its fur damp from the evening drizzle. "All right, little guy," Daniel murmured, kneeling down to dry the pup with a soft towel. His voice was warm, affectionate. "We gotta keep you warm, huh?" Rex closed his eyes. He didn't want to watch this. Then, the moment came. Daniel stood, rubbing the back of his neck as he glanced toward the living room, toward Rex. For the first time in weeks, he seemed to notice the German shepherd lying in the shadows. "Hey, Rex." His voice was cautious, almost hesitant. Rex didn't lift his head. There was silence. Then, Daniel sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "You've been acting weird lately, buddy. Rex remained still, his breath steady, his body unmoving. Daniel exhaled sharply, as if frustrated. He stepped closer. "Come on, man! What's wrong with you?" His tone was still soft, but there was an edge of impatience, like he was waiting for Rex to snap out of it, to return to the dog he used to be. But Rex wasn't that dog anymore. He had tried so hard. But no matter what he did, Daniel's attention, his love, had been given away to something smaller, cuter, newer. Daniel sighed again. Then, before Rex could react, he reached out and ruffled the shepherd's fur. The touch was unfamiliar now. Once, it would have been enough to send Rex's tail wagging, his entire body lighting up with excitement. But now, it just felt foreign, like an afterthought. Rex flinched. Daniel's hand hesitated. He pulled back slightly, a frown deepening on his face. "What the hell, Rex?" he muttered under his breath, pulling his hand away completely. There was something in his voice, not anger, not sadness, but something close to disappointment, and that hurt more than anything else. Rex didn't mean to flinch. He didn't mean to pull away, but it had become instinct. The love he once craved felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to a different version of himself. Daniel shook his head and stepped back, his hands resting on his hips. "I don't know what's gotten into you," he murmured before turning away, heading toward the stairs with the puppy following closely behind. Rex watched them disappear. And for the first time since all of this had started, the pain was replaced by something new. Resignation. He had lost him. And maybe Daniel had lost him too. The storm outside raged through the night, howling winds rattling against the glass panes, shaking the trees that lined the estate. Rex lay awake, his ears twitching at every sharp gust of wind, every distant roll of thunder. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of rain against the roof. Somewhere upstairs, Daniel slept soundly, the small puppy nestled beside him. Rex, however, had never felt more awake. A strange restlessness settled deep in his chest, an ache that no longer stemmed from heartbreak, but from something else entirely. A question. If he didn't belong to Daniel anymore, where did he belong? The thought was terrifying. His whole life had revolved around one man, one home, one unbreakable bond. But that bond had broken, frayed by time, neglect, and the silent replacement of something younger and newer. Rex pushed himself up slowly, his paws pressing into the cold marble floor. His legs felt stiff, his body heavy, but his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. He turned toward the door. He wasn't sure what had brought him here. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the storm calling to him, whispering promises of something beyond the walls of the mansion. Maybe it was the quiet realization that he couldn't stay in a home where he no longer had a place. The doorknob was just out of reach, but Rex had learned long ago how to nudge it open when it wasn't locked. He lifted himself onto his hind legs, pressing his weight against the wood until the latch gave way. The door swung open, revealing the night. The wind was cold, biting against his fur as he stepped forward. The scent of wet earth filled his nose, mingling with the distant aroma of the city beyond the estate's iron gates. Rex took a slow, tentative step onto the wet pavement. Then another. For the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for Daniel to call him back. He wasn't expecting a hand to reach out and pull him home. For the first time, he was walking into the unknown. Behind him, the mansion stood tall, its windows glowing softly against the storm. His home, his past, but not his future. With one last glance, Rex turned his back on the only world he had ever known and disappeared into the night. The rain came down in relentless sheets, soaking into Rex's thick fur as he padded through the empty streets beyond the estate. The world outside felt alien, cold, unforgiving. His paws pressed into the wet pavement, leaving dark imprints on the sidewalk, but there was no one to notice them. The distant hum of the city beyond the hills pulsed like a heartbeat in the night, calling him forward, deeper into the unknown. For the first time in his life, He had no destination. He had been born into certainty, into a life where food was given, shelter was guaranteed, and love, unquestionable, unshakable love, was as constant as the sun rising each morning. And yet, here he was, wandering the streets like a creature without a home. The wind howled, rattling street signs and sending empty cans skittering across the pavement. The scent of damp asphalt mixed with the sour tang of garbage, making his stomach twist with nausea. He had never noticed smells like this before, had never needed to. The reality of his situation settled into him like a slow-growing vine, wrapping around his ribs and pulling tight. He had left Daniel behind, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice, because he wasn't Daniel's good boy anymore. Hours passed, and the streets stretched endlessly before him. He moved through the city's outskirts like a shadow, sticking close to the alleys where the darkness swallowed him whole. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. And remembering hurt. The neon glow of the city had always seemed distant, something seen only through the tinted glass of Daniel's luxury car when they occasionally ventured into town. But now, he was part of it. The towering buildings rose high into the night sky, their windows glowing like artificial stars. Cars hissed past on slick streets, their tires sending up waves of rainwater. Rex flinched as a horn blared nearby, the sharp sound cutting through the air like a knife. He was nothing here, no collar, no name, just another stray wandering through a world that didn't see him. The thought was terrifying. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a deep, insistent ache. It was a new sensation, one he didn't understand. At the mansion, his meals had always come like clockwork, perfect portions placed in a gleaming stainless steel bowl, the scent of fresh meat and kibble a comfort he had never questioned. Now there was nothing. No warm meal waiting for him. No gentle voice calling him inside. Only scraps. The scent of food hit him first. Stale bread, rotting meat, something fried and long forgotten. His instincts took over, leading him toward a nearby dumpster overflowing with discarded remnants. He nosed through the trash hesitantly, his stomach twisting with both hunger and shame. He had never begged, never scavenged. But things were different now. A low growl echoed through the alley. Rex stiffened. A pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the shadows, sharp and predatory. A wiry, battle-scarred dog stepped into the dim glow of a nearby street lamp, lips curled back in warning. A stray. A survivor. The message in its stance was clear. This is my territory. Leave. Rex held his ground for a moment, his instincts battling with his pride. He could fight. He had the strength. But to what end? This wasn't his food. This wasn't his place. Without a sound, he took a slow step back. Then another. The stray waited, muscles coiled, ready to lunge if Rex dared challenge him. But Rex didn't. He turned and walked away. Behind him, the stray let out one last warning growl before burying its snout into the garbage pile, devouring what little remained. Rex didn't look back. This was his life now. By the time dawn began to break, Rex's body felt like it had turned to lead. Exhaustion pressed down on him, his limbs aching with each step. He needed rest. An old, abandoned storefront stood just ahead, its windows boarded up, the faded for lease sign barely visible through the grime. He crawled beneath the awning, collapsing onto the cold concrete. His fur was damp, his stomach empty, his body heavy with weariness. But none of that compared to the weight pressing against his heart. For a long time, he simply lay there, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. This wasn't home. But where was home now? His mind drifted, memories flashing like distant echoes. Daniel's voice, rich with laughter. The warmth of the fireplace, the soft scratch of fingers behind his ears. The sound of his name spoken with love. For a fleeting moment, he thought about going back. about turning around and making the long journey home. But was it home? Would Daniel even care? That place had a new dog now, a new companion, a new good boy. Rex swallowed against the ache in his throat. He had no home. Not anymore. He must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing he knew, voices broke through the haze of exhaustion. Look at him. He's a shepherd. Out here? Rex barely had the strength to lift his head. Two figures stood in front of him, a man and a woman, bundled in thick coats, their faces lined with hardship, but softened with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Kindness. "He doesn't look like a street dog," the woman murmured, kneeling beside him, her fingers reaching out tentatively. "He's too clean, too well fed. He belonged to someone." Rex's ears twitched. The man crouched down, his eyes studying him carefully. "You lost, buddy?" His voice was gentle, warm. Rex didn't know how to answer. The woman extended her hand, palm open, waiting. No force, no demand. Just patience. For the first time in weeks, someone was offering something. Rex hesitated. Her scent was different. Not like Daniel's. Not like the housekeepers who used to pet him absent-mindedly as they passed. It was something softer. She wasn't reaching for him because she had to. She was reaching for him because she wanted to. His body tensed as he lifted his head, pressing his cold nose lightly against her palm. She let out a breath. "Good boy." The words struck him like a thunderclap. They weren't meant for him, not anymore. And yet she said them. She meant them. The man smiled. "Poor guy looks exhausted." The woman nodded. "We can't leave him here." Rex didn't resist as they coaxed him to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. He should have been afraid, should have felt uncertainty clawing at his ribs, but instead, for the first time since he had left the mansion, he felt safe. As they led him away from the cold, rain-soaked streets, he took one last look at the world behind him. Maybe he wasn't lost. Maybe he was just waiting to be found. The warmth of human touch had once been familiar to Rex, expected even. But now, as the woman's fingers brushed against his fur, the sensation felt foreign. He had spent days wandering through the cold, ignored by the world, unseen by the people who walked past. The city was too busy, too indifferent. He was just another lost soul in a place that didn't stop for anyone. Yet here they were. Two strangers kneeling in front of him, eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Concern. The man rubbed his hands together, exhaling into them to fight off the cold. "He's in rough shape." The woman nodded, her expression soft but worried. "Poor thing, he looks exhausted." She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, crumpled paper bag. With careful movements, she unwrapped it, revealing half of a sandwich. "Here, boy," she whispered, breaking off a piece and holding it out. Rex hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to take the food. His stomach burned with hunger. His ribs ached with emptiness. But something inside him made him pause. Trust. He had never had to question it before. With Daniel, he had taken food freely from his hands, had accepted meals as a sign of love, of belonging. But now? Now he wasn't sure what anything meant anymore. Still, hunger was stronger than doubt. Slowly, cautiously, he extended his nose, sniffing the offered morsel before gently taking it from her fingers. The taste of bread and meat filled his mouth, and for the first time in days, he felt relief. "There you go," the woman murmured. "That's a good boy." The words hit him like a ghost from the past. For so long, those words had belonged to someone else, to a different version of him. The dog who once belonged to Daniel, who once had a place, a home, a reason to exist. Could he still be a good boy without Daniel? He wasn't sure. The man sighed, shaking his head. "What do you think?" Think he has an owner somewhere looking for him? The woman frowned, her hand hovering over Rex's head before finally stroking his damp fur. Maybe, but no collar, no tags, and look at him. If he was lost, someone would have found him by now. The man nodded grimly. If he's been out here for days, no one's looking for him. Rex swallowed, his ears flattening slightly. It was strange, hearing those words spoken out loud. He had known it, deep in his bones, but hearing it confirmed in the quiet voices of these strangers made it real. Daniel wasn't looking for him. No one was. He was alone. The woman exhaled slowly, glancing at the man. We can't leave him here. He hesitated. You sure? She nodded. We'll figure it out. He needs help. Rex felt her hand under his chin, gently guiding his face toward hers. For the first time since he had left the mansion, he met a human's gaze and didn't look away. He expected to see something calculating, some kind of hesitation, like he wasn't worth the trouble. But instead, all he saw was kindness. A quiet warmth settled in his chest. She wasn't Daniel. She never would be. But maybe that was okay. The man stood up first, stretching his arms before offering his wife a hand. She rose to her feet, wiping the rain off her coat before glancing down at Rex again. Come on, big guy, she murmured, taking a careful step back. Let's get you somewhere warm. Rex hesitated. This was it. He could walk away. He could disappear into the city, let the streets claim him, let the hunger and cold become his new reality. Or he could follow them. His paws shifted against the pavement. For days he had wandered without direction, without purpose. For days he had tried to figure out where he belonged. Maybe, for now, he didn't need to know. Maybe he just needed to move forward. Slowly he took a step. The woman smiled. That's it. Another step. The man gave a small chuckle. Guess he's coming with us. Another. And then, just like that, Rex walked away from the dark, empty streets and into something new. Something unknown. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel lost. He felt found. Rex followed the couple through the winding streets of the city, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his steps steady. The rain had finally begun to ease, though the pavement still glistened under the glow of streetlights. He wasn't sure where they were taking him, but for the first time since leaving the mansion, he didn't feel completely alone. The woman glanced back at him every few minutes, offering small reassurances. Almost there, big guy, she murmured, her voice soft but sure. He didn't know what there was. He only knew that anywhere was better than the empty streets. The couple led him down a quieter road, past darkened storefronts and narrow alleyways, until they stopped in front of a small, worn-down building. A faded sign above the door read, Briarwood Animal Shelter. Rex's ears twitched. A shelter. His stomach tightened. The woman crouched beside him, stroking the damp fur along his back. It's not much, she admitted, as if sensing his hesitation. But it's warm. And it's safe. Safe. The word felt foreign to him now. She stood, pushing open the heavy door, and a wave of warmth spilled out, carrying the scent of old blankets and something faintly familiar. Other dogs. The man gestured for him to follow. Come on, buddy. Rex hesitated. The house he had once known had been full of luxury, of gleaming floors and high ceilings. But it had also been cold, isolated. This place felt different. It was smaller, worn by time, but alive. The hum of soft voices, the quiet rustling of movement, the low, rhythmic breathing of sleeping animals. It was all real. For the first time in weeks, he felt something inside him stir. He took a slow step forward, then another, and then, just like that, he crossed the threshold. Inside, the space was modest. The floors were lined with old but clean blankets, and a row of kennels stretched along one wall. Some were occupied, tired eyes blinking at Rex from the shadows. watching him with quiet curiosity. A woman behind the front desk looked up as the couple entered. "You're back late," she said, raising an eyebrow before her gaze landed on Rex. "Found him outside," the man explained, shaking the rain from his jacket. "He looked like he needed a place to stay." The woman sighed, setting down the paperwork she had been sifting through. "Another one?" The woman beside Rex nodded. "We couldn't leave him." The shelter worker studied Rex for a long moment. "He's a shepherd," she murmured, kneeling down to meet his gaze. "You don't see many of those on the streets." Rex held still, his body tense as she reached out a hand. When she touched his fur, he barely flinched. "Good boy," she whispered. That word again. She gave him a small smile before standing. "We'll check for a microchip," she said, motioning toward the back of the shelter. "If he has an owner out there, we'll find them." Rex's heart clenched. An owner. A part of him knew the truth. Daniel wasn't looking for him. But another part, small and desperate, wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. They led him into a separate room, where the woman knelt beside him, holding a small scanner to his side. A soft beep echoed in the space. Silence. The worker frowned, glancing at the screen. "Nothing. No chip," she said. "No record." Rex swallowed. No proof that he had ever belonged to someone. The confirmation settled like a stone in his chest. Daniel had never really planned for him to get lost, because Daniel had never thought he would leave. But he had, and now he was no one. The woman sighed. "Looks like he's staying with us for now." The couple exchanged a glance. The man rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," he said slowly, "that's not the worst thing in the world, is it?" The woman smiled. "No," she said softly, "it's not." Rex wasn't sure what any of it meant, but as they led him back to a warm corner lined with blankets, he realized something. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't outside looking in. He was here. And maybe that was enough. Days passed. Rex stayed at the shelter, adjusting to the quiet routine. It wasn't the mansion. There were no glass windows stretching to the ceiling, no expensive leather chairs, no fireplace crackling in the evening. But it was warm, and people saw him. They spoke to him, fed him, called him by name, not his name, but a name nonetheless. Some of the other dogs had been there longer, their eyes weary, their trust long broken. Others had arrived more recently, their bodies thin from hunger, their fur matted from neglect, and yet they were still here, waiting for something, for someone. And then, one day, it happened. The bell above the front door chimed. Rex barely lifted his head. He had grown used to the sound. People came and went all the time, walking past the kennels, stopping briefly to look, sometimes staying, sometimes leaving empty-handed. But this time, something was different. The voice that spoke was familiar. Too familiar. "Hey," the man said, clearing his throat. I think you might have my dog." Rex's body went rigid. Slowly, he lifted his head, and there he was. Daniel. For a moment, everything stopped. The shelter worker frowned, glancing at the clipboard in her hands. "We scanned him when he came in," she said. "He doesn't have a chip." Daniel shifted, rubbing his jaw. "Yeah, He exhaled sharply. "I never got around to it." His eyes found Rex. Rex's heart pounded. His mind screamed at him to move, to run to him, to forgive. But he didn't. He stayed where he was. Daniel hesitated. "Rex?" His voice was uncertain. Rex didn't move. The worker glanced between them. "How do you know this is your dog?" Daniel swallowed. I know." The shelter worker studied him carefully. "You let him go missing without a chip?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't," he exhaled, running a hand down his face. "I didn't mean to lose him." Silence. Then, softer, almost broken. "I didn't think he'd leave." Rex stared. Daniel's shoulders slumped. He was always there, he murmured. Always waiting for me. No matter how late I got home, no matter how much time I spent away. He always waited. The room was unbearably quiet. Daniel cleared his throat. Until he didn't. Rex's chest ached. Daniel took a step forward. I shouldn't have let things change the way they did, he admitted. I shouldn't have let him feel replaced. The words hung between them. The shelter worker looked at Rex. What do you think, buddy? She asked gently. Daniel held out a hand. Come on, boy, he whispered. Let's go home. Home. But was it still his home? Did he want it to be? The weight of everything pressed down on Rex's chest, and then he made his choice. The shelter was silent. Daniel's hand remained outstretched, his voice still lingering in the air. Come on, boy, he whispered. Let's go home. Rex stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest. Home. For so long that word had meant Daniel. It had meant warm fires and soft hands scratching behind his ears. It had meant waiting by the door, tail wagging, knowing that no matter how long Daniel was gone, he would always come back. But Daniel had come back, and Rex had still felt alone. His paws shifted against the floor, uncertainty rippling through him. Could he really go back? The shelter worker watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. It's up to him, she said softly. You can't just take him back because you feel guilty. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew that this was more than just calling Rex home. It was about whether Rex still wanted to be there. The woman who had found Rex, the one who had fed him, who had led him inside that night, knelt down beside him now, her hand resting gently against his fur. She didn't say anything, didn't urge him forward or hold him back. She just waited. And for the first time in his life, Rex had a choice. He had spent years following commands, knowing his place, waiting for love that he never doubted would always be there. Until it wasn't. Until he realized that love given freely could just as easily be taken away. He looked at Daniel, at the man who had once been his entire world. Then he looked at the woman beside him, the one who had found him in the rain, who had seen him when no one else did. The one who had said he was a good boy even when he didn't feel like one. And suddenly, he knew. Rex took a slow step backward. Daniel's face fell. His hand lowered. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, wanted to argue, to plead, to make Rex understand. But Rex did understand, and he had made his choice. The woman beside him exhaled softly, stroking his fur. It's okay, she whispered. Daniel swallowed, nodding slightly. His shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked small, defeated. Like he was only just realizing what he had lost, what he had thrown away. He took a slow step back, stuffing his hands into his pockets. He gave Rex one last look, one that carried regret, sorrow, maybe even love. But love wasn't enough, not anymore. Take care of him, Daniel murmured, his voice rough before turning away. He walked to the door, paused, and then he was gone. Rex didn't move, didn't chase after him, didn't whimper or cry. He just stood there, solid in his decision. The shelter worker let out a low breath. Guess that settles that. The woman beside him smiled. Yeah, she murmured. I guess it does. She turned to Rex, her eyes soft. You're coming home with us, big guy. Home. A different home. A new home. And this time, it was one he had chosen. His tail gave the smallest wag. For the first time in a long, long time, Rex felt whole. Life has a way of teaching us that love isn't just about loyalty, it's about choice. Rex chose the family that saw him, that valued him, that never made him feel like he had to earn his place. How often do we settle for love that only sees us when it's convenient? How often do we wait for people who never truly cherish us? Maybe it's time we choose differently. What would you have done in Rex's place? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.